When Big Shaq notices a struggling pregnant woman in the crowded terminal, he never imagines his simple act of kindness, giving up his first-class seat, will lead to a life-changing journey. As secrets unravel mid-flight and unexpected alliances form, Shaq discovers that even the smallest gestures can create ripples of hope, redemption, and second chances. What starts as a single choice becomes a powerful story you won't forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport buzzed with its usual chaotic energy, announcements echoing over the intercom, travelers weaving through the maze of gates, and rolling suitcases clicking against the polished floors. Among the crowd, a figure towered above the rest. Big Shaq, clad in a black hoodie and gray sweatpants, moved through the terminal with practiced ease, his wide strides making quick work of the bustling crowd. Despite his attempt at keeping a low profile, the occasional fan spotted him. "Shaq, can I grab a selfie?" A man in his mid-30s called out, holding his phone aloft. Shaq paused, flashing a quick grin. "Sure thing, big guy. Make it quick. Don't want to miss my flight." After a few photos and a handful of enthusiastic handshakes, he was on his way again, pulling his carry-on behind him. As much as he appreciated the love, today he was hoping for a quiet, uneventful trip. His schedule had been relentless lately, and the promise of sinking into a first-class seat and shutting out the world was his only solace. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. Near gate 14, Shaq spotted her. A young woman struggling to balance a bulging duffel bag and a rolling suitcase that clearly had a mind of its own. She was visibly pregnant, her baby bump protruding beneath a faded cardigan. Her face, though lined with exhaustion, held a quiet determination as she tried to wrestle her suitcase upright after it toppled for the third time. Shaq slowed, his gaze narrowing. No one else seemed to notice her struggle, the way people often didn't in the hurried blur of airports. He glanced at his watch. He had time. Adjusting his hoodie, Shaq made his way over. "You need some help with that?" The woman looked up, startled. Her green eyes widened as recognition dawned. "Oh, you're just a guy passing through," Shaq said quickly, his tone gentle but deflecting the inevitable fan moment. "Looks like you're wrestling a gator over here. Let me grab that for you." Without waiting for her response, he reached down and righted the suitcase with one hand, hoisting the duffel bag onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. The woman blinked, flustered. Thank you. You didn't have to." "It's no problem," Shaq said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Where you headed?" Gate 16, she said, gesturing with a nod. "But really, I can manage." Shaq raised an eyebrow, the kind that silenced arguments before they even began. "Gate 16, huh? I'm heading that way. Let's go." As they walked, her initial embarrassment melted into gratitude. "I'm Sarah, by the way, Sarah Mitchell." "Shaq," he replied simply, his name needing no introduction. She laughed softly, her shoulders relaxing just a bit. "Yeah, I think everyone knows that." A moment of quiet settled between them as they maneuvered through the crowded terminal. Shaq glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, noticing the way she kept one hand protectively on her belly, as if shielding the life within. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his tone light but tinged with curiosity. Sarah hesitated, her gaze flickering down. "Yeah, it's just me and the baby, flying back to my hometown. Long story." Shaq nodded, not pressing her for details. "Flying can be rough this far along. You okay?" She offered a small, tired smile. "Better now, thanks to you." By the time they reached her gate, Shaq had drawn a few more curious stares, though most people seemed to respect his unspoken wish for privacy. He set her bags down gently, giving her a brief but warm smile. "There you go, Sarah. Safe travels." Before she could respond, a flight attendant approached Shaq, gesturing toward the boarding line for first-class passengers. "Mr. Shaq, we're ready to board you now." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "First class, huh? Must be nice." Shaq chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not bad." He hesitated for a moment, as if debating something, then nodded. "Take care of yourself, all right?" "You too," Sarah said softly, watching as he walked away. As Shaq joined the line, he couldn't shake the image of Sarah from his mind. Her tired smile, the quiet strength in her voice, the unspoken weight she seemed to carry. For now, he'd done his good deed. But something told him this encounter was far from over. Shaq ducked his head slightly as he stepped onto the plane, his large frame instinctively shrinking to fit the narrow aisle. Even in first class, the space felt tighter than he'd like, but it was nothing he hadn't dealt with before. After years of red-eye flights and packed schedules, Shaq had learned to treasure these rare moments of comfort. The plush leather seats, the legroom, the promise of a hot meal. He could already feel the exhaustion melting away. The flight attendant greeted him with a bright smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Shaq. Your seat is right this way." She led him to the second row of first class, where his seat awaited, wide, luxurious, and practically begging him to sink into it. He dropped his carry-on into the overhead compartment, stretched his arms, and took a deep breath. Finally, a moment to breathe. As the other passengers trickled on board, Shaq leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the faint hum of the engines settle him. But then, a familiar voice from behind the curtain separating first class from economy jolted him from his peace. "Excuse me, can I get some water?" He opened his eyes and turned slightly. He recognized that voice. Sarah Mitchell. Curiosity piqued, Shaq leaned forward, peeking through the gap in the curtain. Sure enough, there she was, hunched awkwardly in a middle seat in the cramped economy section. Her knees pressed against the seat in front of her, and her belly jutted slightly forward, making it clear she wasn't comfortable. The overhead vent blew directly onto her, causing her to shiver slightly as she fumbled with the tiny plastic cup the flight attendant handed her. The rows around her were packed with passengers, some scrolling on their phones, others jostling for elbow room on the shared armrests. It was a far cry from the quiet, spacious sanctuary of first class. Shaq felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't unsee it now. The way her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, the faint lines of worry etched into her face. She looked like someone who desperately needed a break, and yet here she was, wedged between strangers on a long flight. He glanced back at his own seat. The contrast was almost cruel. Shaq rubbed the back of his neck, his thoughts swirling. He'd been looking forward to this first-class seat all week. It wasn't just a luxury. It was a necessity after the grueling schedule he'd been keeping. Games, events, charity appearances. It felt like he hadn't had a moment to himself in months. But then his gaze shifted back to Sarah. She was adjusting her seatbelt, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hand briefly rested on her belly, and the gesture was so instinctively protective that it hit him like a brick. "Damn it, Shaq," he muttered under his breath. Before he could talk himself out of it, he stood, his decision made. The flight attendant nearby raised an eyebrow as he gestured her over. "Something wrong, Mr. Shaq?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, nothing's wrong. Just need a favor." He pointed toward the economy section. "See the lady in the middle seat, row. What is that, 19C? The flight attendant followed his gaze. "The pregnant woman?" "Yeah," Shaq said. "Can you bring her up here? Switch our seats." Her eyes widened. "You want to give her your seat in first class?" "That's right." "But, Mr. Shaq, you paid for—" Shaq held up a hand, cutting her off. "I know what I paid for. Just make it happen, okay?" The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Of course, I'll take care of it." Shaq grabbed his carry-on and made his way toward the back of the plane. Heads turned as he passed, some passengers whispering his name. He ignored them, focusing instead on Sarah's startled expression as the flight attendant explained the situation. "You're giving me your seat?" Sarah stammered, looking up at him with wide eyes. Shaq shrugged, his tone casual. "Figured you could use the legroom more than me. Go on, take it." "But—" "No buts," he interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "You and the baby need it more than I do." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, clearly overwhelmed. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Shaq replied. "Just go enjoy it, and don't worry about me, I'll be fine back here." With some gentle coaxing, Sarah reluctantly made her way to first class. Shaq, meanwhile, squeezed himself into the now vacant middle seat, drawing a few incredulous stares from the passengers around him. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Shaq leaned back and adjusted his long legs as best he could. The seat was cramped, the armrests were narrow, and the guy next to him was already snoring. But as he closed his eyes, he felt something he hadn't expected. Peace. Sometimes, he thought, the best seat on the plane isn't the one with the most space. It's the one that lets you do the right thing. Sarah's eyes fluttered shut as she sank into the plush first-class seat, the soft leather a stark contrast to the hard realities she'd been facing for months. Her body craved rest, but her mind wouldn't allow it. The guilt of taking someone else's seat, a celebrity's no less, warred with the overwhelming relief of having a brief reprieve from the chaos of her life. When the flight attendant offered her a warm towel, Sarah muttered a quiet, "Thank you," her voice cracking slightly. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the towel, the warmth soothing her clammy palms. But it wasn't the first-class amenities that were making her emotional. It was the unexpected kindness. "Hey, you doing all right?" Sarah startled slightly, turning to see Big Shaq standing in the aisle. Despite his massive frame, there was a gentleness in his demeanor. His broad shoulders relaxed, and his deep brown eyes filled with concern. "I'm fine," she said quickly, brushing at her cheeks as if to erase the evidence of tears. Thank you. For this. For everything." Shaq smiled warmly, nodding toward the empty seat beside her. "Mind if I sit for a second?" Sarah shook her head. "Of course not." As he squeezed into the seat, it almost seemed comical, his large frame making the first-class accommodations look like a tight fit. But his presence had an anchoring effect, a steady calm that made her feel safe. "So, what's your story?" he asked, his voice low but inviting. "Not every day I see someone hustling through an airport and then looking like they've got the weight of the world on their shoulders." Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around the armrest. She wasn't used to people asking. Most kept their distance, too caught up in their own lives to notice her struggles. But Shaq's expression held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. "Well," she began, her voice shaky, "it's not exactly a happy story." Shaq leaned back slightly, nodding for her to continue. "I've got time." Sarah swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to her hands. I'm on my way to stay with my sister in Phoenix. She's the only family I have left. I'm trying to start over." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, and she paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I left my husband a month ago," she said quietly, her words carrying the weight of secrets too long buried. "He wasn't a good man. He controlled everything. My money, my friends, what I wore, what I said. And when I found out I was pregnant..." Her voice faltered, and she closed her eyes, a single tear escaping down her cheek. It only got worse. Shaq's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger flashing across his face. But he kept his voice calm. "Did he hurt you?" Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, her lips trembling. "Not at first. It started small. He'd grab my arm too hard or yell if dinner wasn't ready on time. But then it escalated. One night he shoved me into the wall. That's when I knew I couldn't stay, not with a baby on the way." The words hung heavy in the air, the hum of the plane's engines the only sound for a moment. "I left while he was at work," she continued, her voice steadier now. "Took what little I could carry and got on the first bus out of town. I've been staying in cheap motels, trying to scrape together enough to get to my sister." She looked up at Shaq, her eyes filled with equal parts gratitude and vulnerability. "I guess you could say I'm running. But it doesn't feel like I've gotten very far." Shaq exhaled slowly, his fists clenched lightly on his knees. "You did the right thing, Sarah. You're protecting yourself and your baby. That's not running. That's surviving." She let out a shaky laugh, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "Surviving doesn't feel as noble as it sounds." Shaq tilted his head, his expression softening. "Trust me. I've seen enough to know it takes real strength to walk away from something that's hurting you, even when it's all you've known. And you've got that strength, Sarah. I can see it." Her lips parted slightly, as if she didn't know how to respond. The sincerity in his voice was disarming, cutting through the layers of fear and self-doubt she'd been carrying for so long. Shaq continued, his tone firm but encouraging. Look, I'm no therapist, but I know this. You're not alone anymore. You've got your sister waiting for you, and you've got people who care, even if they're strangers right now. Like me. Sarah blinked rapidly, another tear slipping free. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me. Shaq leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Because someone once did the same for me. When I was a kid, there were people who could have turned their backs on me, but they didn't. And that made all the difference. A faint smile tugged at Sarah's lips, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. You're a good man, Shaq. He grinned, leaning back in his seat. Don't let the tabloids fool you. The mood lightened slightly, and for the first time, Sarah felt like she could breathe. The burden of her past hadn't disappeared, but it felt just a little lighter, knowing someone else had shouldered it, even for a moment. As Shaq stood to return to his seat in the economy section, Sarah reached out, catching his hand. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with emotion. For everything. Shaq squeezed her hand gently, his smile warm. You just focus on getting to Phoenix, all right? The rest will figure itself out. As he walked back down the aisle, Sarah watched him go, her heart swelling with gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving. She was moving towards something better. The hum of the plane's engines provided a steady rhythm, a constant that helped ease the turbulence in Sarah's mind. She sipped gingerly at the water offered by the flight attendant, her eyes wandering over the faces of the passengers around her. Shaq, now squeezed into the cramped economy seat a few rows behind her, had struck up an easy conversation with the older woman beside him. His deep laugh carried faintly through the cabin, a grounding sound amidst the controlled chaos of the flight. Sarah felt herself relax slightly, grateful for his presence, even at a distance. But then she noticed him. A man in his late 40s sat a few rows diagonally across from her. His greasy dark hair was combed back, and his wiry frame was wrapped in a cheap gray blazer that didn't quite fit. There was nothing inherently alarming about him at first glance, yet Sarah couldn't shake the way he seemed to linger in her periphery. He wasn't just looking at her, he was studying her. The man's thin lips curled into what might have been a smile, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked onto hers for a fraction of a second before he quickly averted his gaze. Sarah's stomach churned, her hand tightening on the armrest. Her heart raced, and her mind spiraled. Was she being paranoid? After all, it wasn't like she had the luxury of feeling completely safe anywhere, not with her past chasing her. Unable to shake the feeling, she glanced back toward Shaq. His broad shoulders seemed almost comical against the narrow seat, but his presence felt like a fortress of safety. Her eyes caught his, and though she didn't say a word, the faint crease in her brow must have conveyed her unease. Shaq tilted his head, his expression shifting instantly from relaxed to alert. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the row Sarah had glanced toward. The man was now focused on the in-flight magazine in his lap, flipping pages absently. But there was something rehearsed about it, as if he were pretending to be disinterested. Shaq shifted in his seat, craning his neck to get a better view. He caught Sarah's eye again, raising an eyebrow as if to ask, "You okay?" She nodded, but the unease remained etched on her face. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting them momentarily. Shaq used the distraction to stand up, stretching his legs as if the cramped seat had finally gotten the best of him. He casually made his way up the aisle, pausing near Sarah's row. "Everything good here?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. Sarah nodded again, though she leaned toward him slightly. I think someone's watching me," she whispered. Shaq followed her gaze subtly, his dark eyes narrowing as they landed on the man. The stranger's gaze flicked up just as Shaq looked his way. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, before the man dropped his head back to the magazine. Shaq's lips pressed into a thin line. He patted Sarah lightly on the shoulder. "You let me know if anything feels off, all right? I'll be close." She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly under his calming presence. Shaq didn't return to his seat immediately. Instead, he hovered near the galley, casually leaning against the wall while keeping the man in his peripheral vision. The flight attendant passed by, and Shaq stopped her with a polite smile. "Hey, ma'am, quick question. You seen that guy in 22C talk to anyone or act strange?" The attendant, a young woman with auburn hair, glanced toward the man. "Not really. He's been quiet." "Why?" Shaq shrugged, his tone nonchalant. "Just a hunch. Keep an eye on him for me, yeah?" The attendant hesitated, then nodded. "Sure thing, Mr. Shaq Dot." When Shaq finally returned to his seat, his mind churned. Years of instincts, honed both on and off the court, told him something wasn't right. He'd seen men like that before, too still, too calculating, like a predator sizing up its prey. The man shifted in his seat, and for a moment, Shaq caught a glimpse of his hand dipping into his blazer pocket. It emerged holding a small notepad, which the man flipped open. He began scribbling something quickly, his hand moving with purpose. Shaq's fingers curled into fists, his protective instincts roaring to life. He leaned toward the woman next to him. "Ma'am, can you excuse me for just a moment?" "Of course," she said, sliding out of her seat. Shaq stood again, this time moving directly toward the man in 22C. He stopped in the aisle, towering, over him like a shadow. "Everything all right here, bud?" Shaq asked, his voice calm but heavy with authority. The man startled, his pen freezing mid-scribble. He looked up at Shaq, his face a mask of surprise. "Yes, fine. Why?" "Just making sure," Shaq replied evenly, his gaze lingering on the notepad. The man snapped it shut, slipping it back into his pocket. "Is there a problem?" Shaq smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "No problem. Just keeping an eye out." The man shifted uncomfortably, his smile forced. "Well, I'm fine, thank you." Shaq didn't move immediately, letting the weight of his presence settle over the man like a heavy blanket. Finally, he nodded and turned, returning to his seat. From behind, he could feel the man's gaze burning into his back. Shaq settled into his seat, his jaw tight. He wasn't sure what the man's intentions were, but one thing was clear. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Sarah or anyone else on this plane. As the flight attendants began preparing for landing, Shaq leaned forward, catching Sarah's eye one more time. She offered a faint, nervous smile, and he nodded reassuringly. The stranger, meanwhile, sat perfectly still, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The tension in the air was almost tangible, a quiet storm brewing as the plane descended. But Shaq wasn't about to let his guard down, not until Sarah and everyone else were safely on the ground. The steady hum of the airplane engines was interrupted by the captain's voice, announcing upcoming turbulence. Shaq glanced at the fasten seatbelt sign as it illuminated overhead. He didn't think much of it. Turbulence was just part of flying. But as the plane began to shake gently, a sudden gasp from Sarah a few rows ahead pulled his attention. She clutched her stomach, her face contorting in pain. Her water bottle tumbled from the tray table, rolling down the aisle. Shaq's instincts kicked in, and he unbuckled his seatbelt despite the seatbelt light glowing red. "Sarah," he called, his deep voice cutting through the low murmur of concerned passengers. "I think something's wrong," Sarah cried, her voice filled with panic. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead. The turbulence seemed to worsen as Shaq reached her row. Kneeling beside her, he placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "What's happening? Is it the baby?" She nodded, her breathing shallow and erratic. "It's too soon," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't. Shaq, I'm not ready." The flight attendant arrived, her face pale as she assessed the situation. "We need a doctor," she called out, her voice shaking as the plane jolted again. A few hands went up, but one in particular caught Shaq's eye. The mysterious man in the gray blazer. His expression was calm, almost eerily so, as he stood. "I'm not a doctor, but I've had medical training," he said, his tone measured. Shaq tensed. Every instinct told him to keep this guy away from Sarah, but time wasn't on their side. "You know what you're doing?" Shaq asked, his voice low and skeptical. The man nodded. "I've delivered babies before. Trust me." Shaq hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. "All right. but I'm not letting you out of my sight. The flight crew quickly cleared a small area near the back of the plane, converting it into an impromptu medical space. Passengers craned their necks, whispering anxiously as Sarah was carefully moved. "Shaq!" she cried, reaching for him. "I'm right here," he said firmly, taking her hand in his. "You're not doing this alone. We've got you." The plane jolted violently again, and overhead bins rattled as passengers let out startled cries. The turbulence was getting worse, the shaking almost constant now. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing severe turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The attendant glanced at Shaq. "We're going to need someone strong to hold things steady back here." "Say no more," Shaq replied, his massive frame a reassuring presence as he crouched beside Sarah. The mysterious man worked methodically, instructing the attendants to grab supplies, blankets, water, and the small first aid kit tucked in the galley. "What's your name?" Shaq asked the man, his voice low but tense. "Connor," he said without looking up. His hands moved quickly but gently, checking Sarah's pulse and timing her contractions. "Connor, you screw this up." Shaq let the threat hang in the air, his protective instincts roaring beneath his calm exterior. "I won't," Connor replied, meeting Shaq's eyes briefly. For the first time, there was no mockery or menace in his gaze. Just focus. Sarah's breathing came in short gasps, and she squeezed Shaq's hand until his fingers ached. "I can't," she started, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, you can," Shaq said firmly, leaning close. "You're strong, Sarah. You've got this. Just breathe." Connor nodded in agreement, his tone steady as he added, "She's doing fine, but we're going to need to move quickly. This baby isn't waiting for an emergency landing." The flight attendant handed Connor a stack of clean towels. Passengers watched in tense silence as the plane shuddered again, sending another ripple of unease through the cabin. "Shaq," Sarah whimpered, her grip tightening. "I'm scared." Shaq knelt closer, his voice softer now. "I know you are, but I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Minutes felt like hours as the plane rocked and Connor gave calm, concise instructions. The hum of the engines seemed to fade into the background, drowned out by Sarah's labored breathing and the murmurs of worried passengers. And then it happened. A sharp cry pierced the air, fragile but defiant, the baby's first breath. The tension broke like a wave, and a collective exhale swept through the cabin. Sarah sobbed in relief as Connor wrapped the tiny newborn in a blanket. "It's a girl," Connor said, his voice uncharacteristically soft as he handed the baby to Sarah. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she held her daughter for the first time. "Thank you," she whispered, looking between Shaq and Connor. Shaq felt a lump rise in his throat. He'd seen plenty of miracles in his life, but nothing quite like this. Connor stood and stepped back, his demeanor shifting again as he adjusted his blazer. "She's stable for now, but she'll need medical attention when we land." Shaq watched him carefully. "Thanks for stepping up," he said, though his tone carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Connor shrugged, his cool mask slipping back into place. Not all heroes wear capes, right? As he moved to return to his seat, Shaq's eyes followed him, the questions swirling in his mind far from answered. For now, though, his focus was on Sarah and the tiny life cradled in her arms. The storm outside might still rage, but inside, a fragile peace had been found, one that Shaq was determined to protect. The plane touched down in Denver, just as the first rays of dawn spilled over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Sarah clutched her newborn tightly, her heart still pounding from the chaotic events of the flight. Her exhaustion was profound, but there was a new sense of calm in her soul, thanks to the people who had rallied around her when she needed them most. Shaq stood nearby, his imposing frame a reassuring presence as he helped Sarah navigate the crowded terminal. Connor, the enigmatic man who had revealed himself as an unlikely ally during the flight, followed at a respectful distance. "Are you sure you're okay?" Shaq asked gently, his deep voice full of concern. Sarah nodded, her lips trembling with the weight of everything she'd been through. "I think so," she whispered. "It's just a lot." As they approached the baggage claim, Connor cleared his throat, drawing their attention. His usual guarded demeanor had softened, and his gaze met Sarah's with a mixture of caution and sincerity. "Sarah," he began, hesitating slightly before continuing, "there's someone here who's been waiting for you." Her brows knitted in confusion. "What do you mean?" Connor reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He held it up to display a photo of a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair and eyes so similar to Sarah's that there was no mistaking who she was. "Your mother," Connor said simply. Sarah's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "My mom?" Connor nodded. "She hired me to find you. She's been searching for months, desperate to make sure you were safe. She's here, waiting to see you." Shaq watched Sarah closely, noticing the storm of emotions flashing across her face: shock, hope, fear, and something deeper, more vulnerable. He crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his voice low and steady. "Hey, you don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said. "This is your call, Sarah. Whatever you decide, we've got your back." Sarah blinked rapidly, the tears spilling over as she looked down at her daughter. "I thought she didn't care," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I thought she gave up on me." Connor stepped closer, his expression softening. "She didn't, Sarah. She made mistakes. She knows that. But she never stopped loving you. She wants to be part of your life, and your baby's life if you'll let her." The raw emotion in Connor's voice caught Sarah off guard. For the first time, she saw him not as a shadowy figure but as someone who genuinely wanted to help. "Where is she?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Connor gestured toward a quiet corner of the terminal. "Over there." Sarah's gaze followed his gesture, landing on a woman sitting on a bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked older than Sarah remembered, her face lined with worry and years of searching. But the moment their eyes met, the woman stood, hope blooming across her face. "I can't believe it," Sarah murmured. Shaq gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Go on, take your time. We'll be right here." With trembling legs, Sarah stepped forward, her heart pounding with every step. When she finally reached her mother, neither of them spoke at first. They simply stood there, tears streaming down their faces as the weight of years apart fell away. "Mom," Sarah finally managed, her voice breaking. Her mother let out a soft sob, pulling Sarah into a tight embrace. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered. "I've missed you so much." The reunion was quiet but profound, the kind of moment that seemed to make the bustling terminal fade into the background. When they finally pulled apart, Sarah's mother glanced down at the baby in her arms, her tears falling freely. "And this must be my granddaughter," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Sarah nodded, a shy smile breaking through her tears. "Mom, meet Grace. She's beautiful," her mother said, gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. A few steps away, Shaq watched the scene unfold, his arms crossed over his chest. Connor joined him, his expression unreadable. "You did good," Shaq said quietly, glancing at Connor. Connor shrugged, his cool demeanor returning. "Just doing my job." Shaq smirked faintly. "Yeah, sure. You've got a good heart, Connor. You might want to let it show more often." Connor didn't reply, but his lips twitched as if suppressing a smile. When Sarah turned back to them, her face was radiant with relief and joy. She walked over, her mother close behind, and looked up at Shaq with gratitude shining in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah said, her voice filled with emotion. "You already have," Shaq replied with a grin. Her mother extended a hand toward Shaq, her expression warm. "You must be Shaq. Thank you for keeping my daughter safe." Shaq shook her hand, his grip firm but kind. "She's strong. She did most of the work herself." As the group stood together, the early morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, casting a golden glow over the moment. For the first time in years, Sarah felt the heavy burden of loneliness lift, replaced by the warmth of connection and the promise of a brighter future. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was finally living. The warm Denver sunlight streamed through the hospital room's large window, bathing everything in a soft, golden hue. Sarah sat upright in the hospital bed, cradling her newborn daughter, her face radiant with a peace she hadn't felt in years. Grace, tiny and perfect, cooed softly in her arms, her little hands grasping at the air. Shaq entered the room quietly, his towering figure filling the doorway. He carried a small bouquet of daisies in one hand, a sheepish grin on his face. "I wasn't sure what to bring," he said, his deep voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. "I figured flowers are standard, right?" Sarah laughed, her smile wide and genuine. "They're perfect. Thank you, Shaq." He set the flowers down on the bedside table and pulled up a chair beside her. His eyes softened as he looked at Grace, who let out a tiny yawn. "She's a fighter," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Like her mom," Sarah replied, her tone gentle but firm. Shaq chuckled. "And her dad," he added, gesturing to himself. Sarah's smile faltered for a moment, her gaze dropping to the baby. "It's not going to be easy, raising her alone." "You're not alone," Shaq said, his voice steady. "You've got your mom now, and if you ever need anything, you've got me too. You just call, all right?" Sarah looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "You've already done so much. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Shaq said, leaning back in his chair. "Sometimes the right thing to do isn't about getting thanked. It's about showing up." Just then, Sarah's mother entered the room, carrying a bag of snacks and a few bottles of water. Her face lit up when she saw Shaq. "Shaq, I was hoping you'd still be here," she said, setting the bag down and walking over to him. He stood and extended his hand, but she waved it away, pulling him into a warm hug instead. "Thank you for everything you've done for my daughter. For my family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's been my pleasure," Shaq replied, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Sarah's mother turned to her, her eyes bright with affection. "We've been talking about it, and I want you and Grace to stay with me for a while, at least until you're back on your feet." Sarah's eyes widened, surprise and gratitude washing over her. "Mom, are you sure? I don't want to—" "No arguments," her mother interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "You've been through enough on your own. It's time to let someone take care of you for a change." Sarah nodded, her voice catching. "Thank you, Mom." Shaq watched the exchange, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He stood, brushing his hands on his jeans. "Well, looks like you're in good hands." "You're leaving?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "Yeah," Shaq said, his tone light. "I've got a flight to catch, but I wanted to make sure you two were okay first." Sarah hesitated, then reached out, touching his arm lightly. "Wait." He turned back to her, his expression curious. "I've decided on a name," Sarah said, her voice soft but clear. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah? What is it?" She smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Shaquille Grace Mitchell, Shay for short." For a moment Shaq was speechless. His usual confidence seemed to falter as he blinked rapidly, a laugh escaping him. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Sarah nodded. "You saved us. You gave me hope when I thought there wasn't any left. I want her to grow up knowing the kind of kindness and strength you showed me." Shaq rubbed the back of his neck, his expression a mix of humility and gratitude. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay in touch," Sarah said, her smile bright. He nodded, his voice steady. "You've got my number, and I expect updates on every milestone." The room filled with laughter, warmth wrapping around them like a soft blanket. Later, as Shaq walked out of the hospital and into the bustling city streets, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The day had started with a simple decision, a seat on a plane, but it had led to something far greater. As he climbed into a cab, he glanced back at the hospital, a faint smile on his lips. He'd always believed in the power of showing up, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like he'd been exactly where he was meant to be. And somewhere in the quiet corner of his heart, Shaq knew that his actions had set ripples into motion. Ripples that would carry Sarah, Grace, and even himself into a future full of hope, second chances, and the unshakable power of human kindness. If this story of compassion, resilience, and second chances moved you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of the power of kindness. Don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales that inspire and uplift. What's a moment in your life where a small gesture made a big difference? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.